Chapter 1. The Great City of Tenochtitlán. Imagine yourself drifting back in time. The waters are calm. The sun rises gently over a vast valley surrounded by mountains, their peaks often shrouded in thin layers of mist. In the middle of this valley stretches a lake, a great, shining expanse of water that glimmers like polished obsidian beneath the sky. And there, rising from the very heart of this lake, is a city unlike any other. A city that seems to float, resting on water, its streets crisscrossed by canals instead of stone, its gardens sprouting from platforms that drift upon the surface. This city is Tenochtitlán, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and the center of a world both familiar and entirely different. Approach it slowly, from the causeways that stretch like long arms of stone across the water, linking the shore to the city itself. Travelers, merchants, warriors, and farmers walk along these raised paths, their sandals slapping gently on the earth and stone surface, while beside them small canoes glide across the lake, carrying baskets of maize, gourds of chili peppers, sacks of cacao beans, and bundles of firewood. The lake smells faintly of mud and water plants, and in the distance, birds rise and settle, their wings flashing silver in the light. As you draw closer, Tenochtitlán reveals itself in greater detail. The city is not chaotic, but ordered, carefully planned, with causeways leading straight to its heart. Towers and temples rise against the horizon, their stepped pyramids glowing in the sun, while neighborhoods spread outward in neat divisions, each with its canals, marketplaces, and households. From a distance, the city almost seems to float, shimmering, with reflections of whitewashed walls and painted murals flickering on the water's surface. Step inside. The first sensation is sound, the low murmur of people going about their business. The cries of vendors rise from the markets. The splashing of oars echoes through the canals. Children laugh as they chase one another along the edges of the water, while dogs bark lazily, their tails wagging in the warm air. Everything here moves with a steady rhythm, a balance between the stillness of the lake and the ceaseless life of the city. Walk further, and you see the houses of ordinary families. They are made of adobe bricks, plastered smooth and painted white or red. Some are simple, just 1 or 2 rooms, while others, belonging to wealthier families, have courtyards and small gardens. Roofs are often flat, and families dry maize or chili peppers on them beneath the sun. Smoke rises slowly from small hearths where women grind maize on stone metats, preparing tortillas for the morning meal. The smell of fresh bread, roasted beans, and simmering stews drifts through the air. Cross a small wooden bridge over a canal. The water beneath is dark but alive with motion. Fishermen balance in canoes, dropping nets into the lake to catch fish and salamanders. Women lean over the edge to wash clothes, the fabric slapping gently against the water, their voices carrying softly as they chat. Canoes pass beneath you, guided by men with long poles who push firmly against the lake bed, gliding silently past. Some carry passengers, others bundles of firewood, stacks of pottery, or cages filled with squawking turkeys. As you walk, you notice how clean the city feels. The streets are swept. Waste is carefully removed. The canals are maintained, and the water, though earthy, does not stink. The Aztecs are proud of this order. They bring fresh water from the surrounding springs through aqueducts, ensuring the city's people can drink clean water each day. It flows gently through channels, cool and clear, a marvel of engineering that sustains thousands upon thousands of lives. Now, approach the great marketplace of Tlatelolco, the beating heart of trade in Tenochtitlán. It is vast, larger than anything most travelers from distant lands could imagine, capable of holding tens of thousands of people. Here the sound swells, voices rise in haggling and laughter, in greetings and proclamations. Rows upon rows of goods are displayed, woven mats, obsidian blades sharp enough to cut like steel, baskets of cacao beans used as currency, rich green quetzal feathers shining like emeralds in the sun, bright dyes in red, blue, and yellow. Carved wooden masks, clay pots painted with swirling designs, and food everywhere. Smell the roasted maize being sold hot and fresh. Smell the chilies being ground into sauces so pungent they sting your nose. Vendors sell tamales wrapped in steaming leaves, beans boiled with herbs, honey gathered from stingless bees, and chocolate, bitter, foamy, spiced with chili or vanilla, poured into cups and sipped by nobles and traders. People bustle from stall to stall, exchanging goods, gossiping, arguing over prices, or simply watching the spectacle. Here, too, the Pochtecker, the great merchants, conduct their business. They are not ordinary sellers. They travel far and wide, across mountains and deserts, down into jungles, carrying obsidian, turquoise, and cotton cloth to trade for jaguar skins, gold, and rare feathers from lands hundreds of miles away. They are respected, their lives filled with danger and reward, and when they return, their stalls display treasures unseen by common eyes. Step back from the market and wander again through the streets. The canals are everywhere, flowing like veins through the body of the city. Children paddle small canoes, laughing as they splash one another. Men and women steer larger vessels carrying cargo. Along the water's edge grow chinampers, floating fields carefully tended by farmers. They are made from layers of mud, reeds, and soil, anchored with willow trees, and they burst with green, maize plants swaying in rows, beans climbing upward, squash sprawling across the ground. Flowers bloom in bright colors, adding fragrance to the air. These chinampers are the pride of the city, a source of endless food, feeding the tens of thousands who live here. Pause and listen. Hear the conch shells blowing from a distant temple. Hear the steady beat of drums carried on the breeze. Religion is woven into every part of life here. Shrines stand at street corners, decorated with garlands of flowers and offerings of food. People bow their heads as they pass, whispering prayers to the gods who watch over every moment. The great temples rise above the city, pyramids of stone with stairways climbing steeply to the heavens. Priests dressed in feathers and black paint walk slowly, their voices chanting, their incense drifting down in white clouds of copal smoke. As the sun rises higher, the city bustles with energy. Artisans work in their homes, chiseling obsidian into blades sharper than any European sword, painting colorful codices on bark paper, or shaping clay into pots and jars. Feather workers sit patiently, arranging quetzal feathers into elaborate headdresses, shimmering like rainbows. Jewelers carve jade and turquoise, making necklaces and ornaments for nobles. Every corner of the city hums with creation, labor, and the quiet pride of skill. Climb now, slowly, to the center, the great plaza where the Templo Mayor stands. The plaza is immense, open and wide, capable of holding thousands. The pyramid towers above, its twin shrines at the top dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Painted bright, its steps steep, it dominates the city, a reminder of the god's presence in every heartbeat of life. Around the plaza stand palaces, schools, and smaller temples. Nobles walk here in fine cotton garments dyed bright, their hair tied with feathers, their ears and noses glinting with gold and jade. Commoners look on with respect, bowing their heads slightly as they pass. Life here is not hurried. It is steady, rhythmic. The people rise with the sun, work through the day, and gather in the evenings with their families. They eat tortillas, beans, chili, and maize, often flavored with herbs, sometimes with turkey or fish from the lake. Children play with small clay toys, rolling balls, or imitating their parents' work. At night, fires glow within the houses, and the city lights flicker across the water, mirrored by the stars above. And so Tenochtitlan breeds, a city alive with order and chaos, with labor and leisure, with markets and temples, with laughter and prayer. To walk its streets is to walk in another world, one balanced carefully between water and stone, between the everyday and the divine. Here, in the heart of the Aztec Empire, life unfolds slowly, in rhythms as ancient as the lake itself. Chapter 2: Farmers of the Valley. The city of Tenochtitlan may have been the heart of the empire, with its great temples, wide marketplaces, and endless canals, but its lifeblood came not from stone, but from earth. To understand the Aztec world, one must leave behind the crowded plazas and the bustling causeways, and wander outward into the countryside that cradled the valley. Here, beyond the noise of drums and the cries of merchants, stretches the quieter rhythm of the fields, where farmers rose with adorn and bent their backs to the land, season after season, year after year. The Valley of Mexico was no ordinary land. Ringed by mountains, filled with lakes, and blessed with fertile soil, it was both a challenge and a gift to those who worked it. At dawn, mist often drifted low across the ground, blurring the line between water and earth. Farmers knew these mists, and they knew the seasons, the dry months when the sun blazed and the rains held back, and the wet months when thunder rolled across the mountains and water poured from the sky. Theirs was a world of cycles, of waiting, planting, growing, and harvesting, bound always to the rhythm of the earth and the will of the gods. Begin by walking among the chinampers, those strange and marvelous floating gardens that stretched out into the lakes around Tenochtitlan. They were not truly floating, though to a stranger they might seem so. Each was built with patience and skill, a platform of reeds and mud layered again and again until it rose solid from the water. Willow trees were planted at the edges, their roots sinking deep to anchor the soil, their branches shading the crops. On these long, narrow plots, green rows of maize stretched tall, beans coiled upward along stalks, squash sprawled across the ground with wide leaves, and flowers added bright bursts of yellow and red. To walk through the chinampers was to walk through a patchwork of green, separated by narrow canals where canoes slipped silently, carrying farmers, tools, or baskets of produce. The chinampers were the pride of the Aztec farmers, a system that fed tens of thousands. Each was tended carefully, passed down through families, worked by the same hands year after year. Men rose early, while the mist still clung to the water, and poled their canoes out to their plots. They carried digging sticks, stone hoes, and baskets. Women sometimes accompanied them, children perched at the front of the canoe, sleepy-eyed, their small hands dangling in the water. When the sun rose, work began. Weeds were pulled, soil was turned, seedlings were planted. The farmers spoke little as they worked, their movements practiced, their rhythm steady, the splash of water and the calls of birds the only sounds around them. Maize was the heart of it all. More than food, it was life itself, a gift from the gods, a crop that formed the core of every meal and every ritual. The farmers knew each stage of its growth. First, the kernels were pressed into the soft soil, then shoots appeared, pale green, fragile. As the stalks grew tall, beans twined up them, clinging and curling, while squash spread below, their wide leaves shading the earth, keeping it cool and moist. Together, maize, beans, and squash formed the three sisters, a trinity of sustenance that fed families across the empire. Their growth was slow, but steady, and farmers watched them with patience, tending them as they had been tended for generations. The air around the chinampers was thick with life. Insects buzzed, dragonflies darted, frogs croaked at the water's edge. Birds skimmed the surface, their wings flashing in the sunlight. Occasionally, a farmer would pause, lean on his digging stick, and gaze across the water. From here, he could see the city rising in the distance, its temples and towers gleaming, but he did not belong to the stone world of the nobles and priests. His was the world of soil and water, of seeds and harvests, of days measured not by ceremonies but by the turning of the sun and the needs of the crops. Life as a farmer was not easy. The work was constant, the body always bent, the skin always exposed to sun and rain. Blisters formed on the hands, backs ached, and feet sank into mud. There were pests to fight, droughts to endure, floods to survive. Yet the farmers knew no other way. Their fathers and grandfathers had done the same, and their children would follow. To farm was to live, and to live was to serve the gods who had given maize to the people. Beyond the Chenampers, in the drier lands of the valley, farmers worked the open fields. Here the soil was tilled with digging sticks and stone hoes, the rows straight, the crops spread wide. Families lived in small villages, their houses made of adobe, clustered together for company and protection. Each morning, smoke rose from hearths as women ground maize into marser for tortillers, and men shouldered their tools, heading to the fields. Children followed, carrying water gourds or helping to chase away birds. The days were long, the sun unrelenting, but the rhythm of work was steady. Songs were sung to lighten the labor, short chants that spoke of the earth, the rain, and the promise of the harvest. The rains were everything. Without them, the crops withered. Farmers prayed to Tlaloc, the god of rain, leaving offerings at small shrines in the fields. Flowers, food, and incense were given, sometimes even the blood of a bird or a few drops from a farmer's own finger, cut with a sharp thorn. They asked for mercy, for rain to fall in time, for the soil to drink deeply. When the rains came, there was joy. Children danced in the puddles, men and women lifted their faces to the sky, and the earth grew rich with life. But when the rains failed, hunger followed. Bellies ached, and families tightened their belts, stretching tortillas thinner, boiling herbs and roots to fill the pot. In such years, life was hard, and farmers looked anxiously to the temples, waiting to see what sacrifices the priests would make to call the rains back. Farming was not only labor but also knowledge. The farmers knew when to plant by watching the sky, the stars, and the turning of the sacred calendar. They read the signs of nature, the flight of birds, the color of dawn, the feel of the wind. They knew which soil was best for maize, which for beans, which for squash. They saved seeds from year to year, carefully choosing the strongest, the healthiest. They knew how to mix mud and reeds to strengthen the Chenampers, how to guide water into the plots, how to build small channels to prevent flooding. This knowledge was passed down quietly, from parent to child, in the fields themselves, through work and example. Families shared the burden together. Men tilled the soil, women helped with planting and weeding, children learned by watching and imitating. In the evenings, after the day's labor, families gathered in their homes. They ate simple meals, tortillas, beans, chili, sometimes fish or turkey if it was available. The fire crackled softly, shadows danced on the adobe walls, and stories were told. Old tales of the gods, of creation, of heroes and battles. Children listened, their eyes heavy with sleep, the rhythm of their parents' voices carrying them into dreams. The life of the farmer was slow, repetitive, bound to the turning of seasons. Yet it was also steady, predictable. There was comfort in the cycles. Planting followed harvest, harvest followed planting, each year repeating the last. In this repetition lay survival, and in survival lay meaning. Farmers did not seek glory in battle or wealth in trade. Their honor was in the furrows of their fields, in the green of their crops, in the full bellies of their children. Chapter 3: Craftsmen and Traders. Within the wide empire of the Mexica, life did not rest solely upon the shoulders of farmers. Though the fields provided food and the temples gave meaning, there was another heartbeat within the land, steady and constant, shaping the world with quiet hands. It was the work of the craftsmen and the movement of the traders that brought beauty, wealth, and connection into every corner of the Aztec realm. Without their labor and their journeys, the empire would have been a shell of stone and maize alone. To walk among them is to see how patient hands and long journeys made the world turn. Begin with the artisans, the men and women whose skill transformed raw material into objects of use, of beauty, and of power. In the quiet streets of Tenochtitlán and in villages across the valley, the sound of tools echoed each day. The rasp of stone against stone, the scrape of bone tools against wood, the soft rhythmic beat of feathers being pressed into place, the hollow tap of clay being shaped. These were the sounds of the artisan's world, steady, deliberate, repeated day after day until they became as familiar as the beating of a drum. One of the most prized of all crafts was the shaping of obsidian. This black volcanic glass, found in the lands around the Valley of Mexico, was sharper than any metal known to the people. In the dim light of workshops, men sat with stone hammers and flakes of obsidian, striking with practiced precision. Each blow sent a chip flying, leaving behind an edge so fine it could slice with ease. They made knives for sacrifices, blades for warriors, scrapers for farmers, and mirrors that reflected the world in a dark, smoky sheen. To hold an obsidian blade was to hold something that seemed born of both earth and shadow, dangerous and beautiful at once. The craftsmen who shaped it worked with patience, their hands steady, their knowledge passed down through generations. Nearby, the feather workers practiced their delicate art. Their world was one of color, light, and endless patience. Feathers from parrots, macaws, quetzals, and hummingbirds were sorted carefully, each chosen for its hue and texture. The feathers of the quetzal, shimmering green and impossibly long, were the most prized, brought from distant forests to the south. The artisans sat with fine tools, laying feathers one atop another, pressing them into place with a mixture of sap and glue, until images emerged, birds in flight, gods descending from the heavens, suns bursting with rays of light. They made cloaks for nobles, headdresses for priests, shields for warriors, and fans for ceremonies. Each was more than decoration. To wear feathers was to carry the sky upon one's body, to show connection to the divine. The artisans worked quietly, their eyes focused, their movements small, their lives bound to the delicate beauty of their creations. Elsewhere, potters shaped clay drawn from the earth. They sat on the ground, turning lumps of mud with their hands, smoothing, shaping, hollowing. Their fingers knew the feel of good clay, the right mix of grit and softness. They made jars for storing maize, bowls for serving food, cups for drinking chocolate, and incense burners for the temples. Some were plain, simple, made for everyday use. Others were painted with swirling designs, with jaguars and serpents, with flowers and gods. The kilns glowed at night, small fires that transformed soft clay into hardened vessels, fragile but lasting. The smell of smoke and earth hung in the air, a reminder that even the simplest cup carried the touch of human hands. Jewelers, too, filled the markets with wonders. They worked jade, turquoise, and gold, stones and metals that shone like captured sunlight. Their tools were small, their labor slow. They carved tiny beads, drilled holes with reed drills, polished surfaces until they gleamed. They made ear spools, nose ornaments, necklaces, and bracelets. Each piece was a mark of status, worn by nobles, by warriors, by priests. In their small workshops, the jewelers bent close to their work, their eyes straining, their hands steady. A mistake could shatter the stone, wasting days of labor. Yet they persevered, for the demand was constant, the desire for beauty unending. Painters and scribes gave another kind of craft. They worked not in stone or clay, but in images and words. On sheets of bark paper or stretched deer skin, they painted codices filled with symbols and colors. Red, Blue, yellow, black, each carried meaning. They recorded tribute owed by conquered towns, the calendar of festivals, the lineage of rulers, the stories of gods. Their work was both art and memory, preserving knowledge across generations. To read a codex was to step into another way of seeing, where time unfolded not in lines but in cycles, where gods and humans shared the same space. The scribes worked with brushes made of hair, dipping them into pigments ground from minerals and plants, their strokes careful, deliberate. Each page was a world unto itself, fragile yet enduring. All these artisans filled the markets with their goods. The great square of Tlatelolco was their stage, a place where their labor met the eyes of thousands. Here, rows of stalls displayed obsidian blades that gleamed in the sun, feather cloaks that shimmered with every movement of air, clay pots stacked in neat pyramids, jewelry that caught the light like stars. Painted codices that told the stories of gods and kings. Buyers moved among them, haggling, admiring, choosing. The artisans themselves sat quietly, their goods spread before them, their hands resting after long hours of work. For them, the market was both livelihood and pride, a chance to see their labor valued, their skill acknowledged. But there were others in the market whose lives stretched far beyond the city's walls, the traders, the pottecker. These men were not ordinary sellers. They were travelers, adventurers, risk-takers, and spies. They carried the goods of Tenochtitlan to the farthest reaches of Mesoamerica, and they brought back treasures unseen by most. Their journeys took them across mountains and deserts, through forests and along coasts, places filled with danger and opportunity alike. The pottecker set out in groups, carrying their loads on their backs, supported by tumplines that crossed their foreheads. They carried cotton cloth, obsidian, salt, and cacao beans to trade. Along the way, they faced bandits, storms, hunger, and thirst. They slept under the stars, cooked meager meals over small fires, and walked for days without rest. Yet their eyes were always open, their ears always listening. They were not merely traders, but also gatherers of information, learning about the lands they passed, the people they met, the strengths and weaknesses of distant towns. When they returned, they carried not only goods but also knowledge, a valuable gift for the rulers of the empire. In the markets of distant lands, the pottecker laid out their wares and bartered for what they could. They brought back jaguar pelts, bright and spotted, the mark of strength and ferocity. They returned with brilliant feathers from tropical birds, colors that shone like fire and sky. They carried gold dust, copper bells, and shells from the coasts, rare woods from the forests, and even slaves taken in trade. Each item was a treasure, each a sign of distant places connected by the traders' weary feet. When the pottecker returned to Tenochtitlan, they entered the market with pride. Their stalls displayed wonders that drew crowds, their voices carried tales of far-off lands, their goods reminded the people of the empire's reach. They were respected, honored, even feared. For though they were commoners by birth, their wealth gave them influence, and their knowledge gave them power. They lived in their own neighborhoods, bound by their own guilds, sworn to secrecy in their dealings. To betray their trust was to risk death, for the pottecker guarded their role fiercely. The lives of craftsmen and traders were not easy. The artisans bent over their work until their backs ached, their fingers raw. Their eyes strained in the dim light, their lungs filled with dust from stone, smoke from kilns, the fine hairs of feathers. The traders walked until their feet bled, until their shoulders groaned beneath the weight of their burdens. They risked hunger, disease, and death on the road. Yet both found meaning in their labor. The artisans saw their skill made visible, their work worn by nobles, used by priests, admired by neighbors. The traders saw the empire stretch outward, felt the pride of bringing back riches no one else could. Together, they formed a web that bound the empire. From the obsidian quarries to the feather-rich forests, from the potter's kilns to the far-off markets, their work connected people, places, and gods. Without them, the Aztec world would have been poorer, plainer, narrower. With them, it was rich, colourful, expansive, alive. And so the days passed, one after another, the artisans rising with the sun to shape and paint, the traders setting out on long roads, the markets filling with voices and colours. Slow, steady, repeating, as life always does. The hands of craftsmen and the feet of traders shaped an empire, not with swords or with prayers, but with patience, endurance, and quiet pride. Chapter 4. Farmers and Food. In the great empire of the Mexica, where cities rose from the waters and temples pierced the sky, there was one truth that bound all lives together. Without the farmer, without the steady work of hands in the soil, nothing could endure. Kings might rule, priests might pray, warriors might fight, traders might journey, craftsmen might shape, but all of them depended upon the silent, tireless labor of those who bent their backs to the earth. It was the farmer who fed the empire, who made life possible, who turned barren land and watery lakes into fields of abundance. To walk among them is to walk in the true heartbeat of the land, slow and patient, steady as the rising of the sun. The Valley of Mexico was not an easy place to farm. The lakes that shimmered in the sunlight were both gift and challenge. Their waters nourished the soil, yet they swallowed land, leaving little space for planting. The rains came in floods during one season, then abandoned the earth in dryness during another. The soil was fertile in some places, thin and stony in others. Yet the Mexica were not deterred. Through patience, ingenuity, and endless labor, they bent the land to their will, turning marshes into gardens, shores into fields, waters into fertile ground. Their answer to the challenge was the chinamper, the floating garden, though in truth it did not float at all, but was rooted firmly in the lake bed. To see a chinamper is to witness human persistence woven with nature's gifts. First, the farmer marked out a rectangle in the shallow waters, driving stakes of reeds and wood into the lake bed. Between these stakes, he wove mats of reeds, creating a frame that would hold earth in place. Into this frame he piled mud dredged from the lake bottom, rich in nutrients, mixed with rotting vegetation gathered from the shores. Slowly, layer upon layer, the rectangle rose above the water, a strip of fertile land born from mud and patience. Along the edges, he planted willows or ahujote trees, their roots reaching deep, their trunks anchoring the chinamper against wind and wave. With time, the island held firm, a piece of earth conjured from the water. Now came the work of planting. On the raised beds, farmers sowed maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, and amaranth. Between the rows, they planted flowers, for beauty was never forgotten. They worked with wooden digging sticks, simple yet effective, pressing holes into the soil, dropping seeds, covering them with care. They watered with clay jars dipped from the canals, their bare feet sinking into mud as they moved from plant to plant. They pulled weeds by hand, bent low over the rows, their backs aching beneath the sun. They worked in silence or in soft conversation, their lives bound to the slow rhythm of growth. The chinampers were marvels of abundance. Because the soil was rich and constantly renewed by dredging mud from the canals, harvests came quickly and often. Maize could be gathered several times a year. Beans climbed the maize stalks, squash sprawled across the ground, each supporting the other in the ancient triad of planting. Chili peppers added heat to meals, while amaranth provided tiny seeds rich in nourishment. Flowers grew bright, their petals later offered in temples or sold in markets. The canals between the chinampers teemed with fish, ducks, and frogs, adding meat to the diet. Everything worked together, every part of land and water contributing. In the mornings, farmers rose before the sun, their calloused hands gathering tools, their bodies already weary from a lifetime of labor. They walked narrow paths between the Chenampers, their reflections broken in the still water. Birds stirred in the reeds, frogs croaked softly, and the first light of day spread across the lake. Work began quietly, without ceremony, for there was no end to it. Fields needed tending, canals needed clearing, mud needed dredging, seeds needed planting. Each day repeated the one before, each season followed the same cycle, each year brought the same demands. It was endless, but it was life. The women of the farmer's household carried their own share of the labor. They ground maize on stone mettets, their arms straining as they pushed the heavy stone back and forth, until the kernels broke into meal. They shaped tortillas by hand, patting them into thin circles, laying them on hot stones to bake. They cooked stews of beans and squash, stirred pots of chili, prepared tamales wrapped in leaves. Their labor was as constant as the men's, their rhythm steady, their bodies shaped by repetition. Without them, the harvest would mean nothing, for it was their work that transformed grain into nourishment, plants into meals, abundance into life. Children too learned early the ways of farming. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, carrying small tools, learning how to plant, how to weed, how to dredge mud without spilling. Girls stayed near their mothers, watching, imitating, grinding maize with small stones, shaping tortillas with small hands. They learned by doing, slowly, without pause, their childhood bound to labor. Play existed, but it was fleeting, tucked between chores, woven into moments of rest. From the first steps, they were prepared for the endless cycle of work that awaited them, for farming was not a choice but a necessity, not a profession but a life. Beyond the Chenampers lay other kinds of fields, dry lands where rainfall alone nourished the soil. Here, the farmers planted with hope more than certainty. Wooden hoes broke the earth, seeds were pressed into dust, and prayers were whispered to Tlaloc, the rain god, begging for mercy. When rains came, crops grew. When rains failed, hunger followed. Families watched the skies, counted the days, marked the clouds. They knew too well the difference between abundance and famine, between full bellies and empty ones. Their lives hung upon the shifting moods of the weather, beyond their control, beyond their power to change. The farmers were bound not only to their own families, but also to the empire itself. Tribute was demanded from every village, every household, every field. Maize, beans, chilies, cotton, and other goods were gathered by officials, counted carefully, carried away to the storehouses of Tenochtitlan. The farmer gave what was required, sometimes more than he could spare. Hunger at home was no excuse. The empire's needs came first, the temple's demands outweighed the family's. It was a burden, heavy and resented, yet inescapable. To refuse was to invite punishment, perhaps even death. So the farmer bent his back again, worked harder, gave more, endured. Yet farming was not without moments of beauty, even of joy. In the fields, flowers bloomed between the rows, their colors bright against the green of maize. Birds flew overhead, their wings flashing in sunlight. Children laughed as they splashed in canals, their voices carrying across the water. Families gathered in the evenings, sharing meals, telling stories, singing songs. Festivals broke the monotony, feasts marked the harvest, dances honored the gods. Life was harsh, but it was also filled with rhythm, with meaning, with connection to earth and sky. A farmer knew weariness, but he also knew the quiet satisfaction of seeing plants grow, of filling baskets with food, of feeding those he loved. Step back and see the whole of it, the Chenampers stretching like a checkerboard across the lake, the fields on the hillsides, the villages scattered among them. Smoke rising from cook fires, boats gliding along canals, voices drifting across the water. This was the true foundation of the empire, stronger than stone, more enduring than war. For without the farmer, no temple could rise, no army could march, no market could bustle, no trader could journey. The farmer was the beginning and the end, the silent strength upon which all else rested. And so the days continued, one after another, the sun rising, the farmers bending to their work, the women grinding maize, the children learning their tasks. Each movement repeated, each season following the last, each life bound to the soil. The cycle was endless, yet it carried within it the simple truth of survival. Through patience, through labor, through the steady rhythm of farming, the Mexican endured. Chapter 5. Warriors of the Sun. In the heart of the Aztec world, where temples rose like mountains of stone and the great lake shimmered beneath the sun, there lived a class of men who stood apart from farmers, traders, and craftsmen. These were the warriors, the chosen ones of Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, men who bore arms not only to defend their city but to feed the gods with the living blood of captives. They were known as the guardians of the Mexican, the shield of Tenochtitlán, the bringers of tribute, the hunters of men. They were feared by enemies, honored by their people, bound by duty to their gods. To understand the empire, one must walk slowly among them, watching their training, their rituals, their battles, and their daily lives, until the rhythm of their existence unfolds. The path of a warrior began in childhood. Boys were not left to idleness, for the Mexican believed that strength and discipline must be shaped early. At birth, if a child was male, a tiny shield and a bundle of arrows were placed in his hands as a symbol of his destiny. Even before he could walk, the promise of warfare marked his life. As he grew, he listened to the stories of warriors, tales of bravery, of battles fought and captives taken, of glory won upon the field. He heard the drums echo across the city when armies returned victorious, saw captives led through the streets, watched as offerings were made atop the Templo Mayor. He learned that to fight was not merely to defend but to serve the gods themselves, for war was the sacred duty that kept the sun moving across the sky. At the age of 15, boys entered formal training. Some went to the Tenochtitlán, the house of youth, where commoners learned the discipline of war. Others, the sons of nobles, entered the Karmakak, the house of lineage, where priests and teachers instructed them not only in war but also in ritual, in governance, in the duties of leadership. In the Tenochtitlán, boys rose before dawn, their bodies hardened by labor, their spirits shaped by discipline. They carried firewood for the temples, they worked the fields, they dug canals. Their muscles grew strong not only through drills of combat, but through the endless work that sustained the city. They slept little, ate modestly, endured punishments when they faltered. Their teachers were harsh, for war demanded obedience and endurance. Training was slow, repetitive, unrelenting. Boys learned to run long distances without rest, to carry heavy loads upon their backs, to throw spears with precision, to wield the macuahuitl, the obsidian-edged club that was the pride of the Mexican warrior. They learned to shoot arrows, to use shields, to fight in formation. They learned the songs of war, the cries that would rise across the battlefield, the rhythms that stirred courage. They practiced together, side by side, until their movements were one, their strength bound together, their spirits molded into the shape of warriors. The weapons of the Mexican were not of iron or steel, but of wood, stone, and obsidian, yet they were no less deadly. The macuahuitl, a long wooden sword edged with sharp blades of obsidian, could slice through flesh with ease, its edge sharper than metal. The atlotl, a spear thrower, hurled darts with great force, piercing armor and shields. Bows and arrows rained down upon enemies from afar, while clubs and spears served in close combat. Shields of woven reeds or wood, often covered with hide and decorated with bright feathers, protected the body. Helmets shaped like jaguars or eagles, adorned with feathers and paint, gave the warriors both protection and the likeness of the animals they revered. To fight was to honor the gods. Above all, it was to serve Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, who demanded the nourishment of blood to keep his strength in the endless battle against darkness. Every captive taken upon the field was not merely an enemy subdued, but a gift for the temple, a life to be offered upon the stone. War was not waged for conquest alone, but for sacrifice, for the feeding of gods. The warriors knew this, and they bore the burden of it. To fail to capture was to fail in duty. To return without prisoners was a shame, a mark of dishonor. To take captives, however, was to rise in rank, to earn feathers and titles, to gain honor for one's family. The ranks of warriors were many. A commoner might fight bravely, capturing his first enemy, and be raised to the status of a Yeotl, a true warrior. With more captives, he could become an eagle or a jaguar, members of elite orders, their bodies clad in suits of feathers and skins, their helmets fierce, their presence feared. Nobles could rise higher still, commanding troops, leading armies, wearing costumes that blazed with color, their shields bright with symbols of power. Each rank was earned through capture, through proof of valor, through the spilling of blood and the taking of lives for the temple. The warrior's path was slow, demanding, yet filled with the promise of glory. The life of a warrior was not only battle but also ritual. Before campaigns, priests led ceremonies, offering incense, flowers, and sometimes blood to the gods. Warriors painted their bodies, donned their feathered suits, carried banners upon their backs. They marched out of the city to the sound of drums and conch shells, their feet pounding the causeways, their voices raised in chants. Families watched them depart, wives and mothers praying for their safe return, children gazing in awe. The city held its breath until they came back, bearing prisoners, carrying spoils, singing songs of triumph. On the battlefield, the Mexicar fought with discipline. Formations advanced together, shields raised, spears ready. Darts flew, arrows darkened the sky, the clash of obsidian on wood rang out. Warriors sought not death but capture, for a captive was worth more than a slain foe. They grappled, struck with the flat of their weapons, bound their enemies with ropes. The strongest and bravest faced the fiercest opponents, eager to prove themselves, eager to win captives for sacrifice. The cries of battle mixed with the sound of drums, the smoke of fires, the dust of the field. It was chaos, yet within it was order, for each man knew his role, each sought his place in the endless cycle of war and offering. When battles were won, captives were led back to Tenochtitlán. They marched through the causeways, their hands bound, their heads bowed, their fate certain. Crowds gathered to see them, to jeer, to marvel. They were paraded to the temples, where priests awaited, where drums sounded, where fires burned. There, atop the Great Pyramid, their blood would flow, their hearts lifted to the sky, their lives given to Huitzilopochtli. The warriors watched, their duty fulfilled, their honor secured, their gods satisfied. Daily life for a warrior, when not on campaign, was slower, yet never idle. They trained constantly, keeping their bodies strong, their skills sharp. They joined ceremonies, served as guards for the temples or the palace, carried messages, stood in councils. They wore their costumes proudly, their feathers bright, their shields polished, their helmets fierce. In the marketplace, they were recognized, respected, honored. Children gazed at them with admiration. Women spoke of their bravery. Men acknowledged their strength. Their status was secure, their lives bound always to war, to duty, to the service of gods and empire. Yet even in their honor, they bore burdens. To live as a warrior was to live always under the demand for more. More captives, more battles, more offerings. To falter was to lose honor, to be shamed, to fall in rank. Injuries were common. Scars marked their bodies. Pain lingered long after battles ended. Death was never far, for even the strongest could fall in combat, even the bravest could meet an end. They accepted this, for to die in battle, to fall with weapon in hand, was to be promised a place in the sun, to accompany Huitzilopochtli across the sky, to rise again with the dawn. And so, day after day, year after year, the warriors of the Mexica lived their lives. From boys trained in hardship, to men adorned with feathers, to captains leading armies, their path was steady, their rhythm unbroken. They rose with the sun, they honored the gods, they bore arms, they captured, they offered. Their cycle was as endless as that of the farmers, as steady as the turning of seasons, as necessary as the rising of the sun itself. For without the warrior, the gods would starve, the sun would falter, the empire would crumble. They were the shield and the sword, the hunters and the hunted, the guardians of the Mexica world. Chapter 6: Markets and Merchants. The city of Tenochtitlan, resting in the middle of the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, was not only a place of temples, palaces, and canals. It was also a place of trade, a place of exchange, and a place where the daily life of tens of thousands of people revolved around the movement of goods. To understand the Aztec world, one must walk slowly through its markets, breathe in the air thick with the mingled scents of food and incense, and listen to the endless murmur of bargaining voices. This was not merely a matter of buying and selling, but a rhythm of life, a cycle that sustained the empire and shaped the very texture of existence. The greatest of all these markets was the one at Tlatelolco, the sister city of Tenochtitlan. Though joined together by alliance and rivalry, Tlatelolco became famed throughout Mesoamerica for the vastness and order of its market. Contemporary accounts, written by Spaniards who witnessed it in the early 16th century, tell us that as many as 60,000 people might gather there on a busy day. The numbers themselves strain belief, and yet, when one imagines the dense neighborhoods of the valley, the farms, the villages, the causeways leading in from all directions, one begins to realize that the market was a magnet pulling in goods, wealth, and people from every corner of the empire. Imagine approaching this great market on an ordinary day. The sun rises above the mountains, its light glinting off the waters of the lake. Farmers and traders move along the causeways, carrying baskets strapped to their backs. Some lead canoes filled with produce through the canals, gliding silently, their paddles stirring the still water. Others drive turkeys before them, the birds waddling in groups, while women balance pots of cooked tamales on their heads. By the time the sun has climbed higher, the open square of Tlatelolco is alive with movement. The layout was not chaotic. It was carefully organized, for the Aztecs valued order and regulation. Goods were grouped by type, and merchants took their places according to custom. To one side were the sellers of maize, beans, squash, and chilies, the staples of daily life. Nearby were the vendors of fruits, prickly pears, avocados, guavas, and cacao beans. Further on, one would find cotton cloths of every quality, from rough mantles used by common folk to fine garments woven so delicately that they seemed almost to shimmer. The air was filled with sounds. Buyers called out their offers, sellers replied, and laughter erupted as bargains were struck. The smell of roasting maize mixed with the scent of flowers, copal incense, and the less pleasant odor of hides and fish. Dogs barked as they were led to sale, for even dogs were part of the market economy, valued for food as well as companionship. Every sense was engaged, and for one wandering slowly through, the market became a world in itself. In the heart of the square stood officials, men chosen to oversee the transactions. They were judges and regulators, ensuring fairness and punishing dishonesty. If someone tried to cheat by using false measures or by selling poor goods at high prices, the officials had the authority to seize them, fine them, or in more serious cases, impose harsher penalties. Trade was not left to chance, for the Aztec Empire depended on stability, and stability required trust. Currency itself took unusual forms. The Aztecs had no coins, but they used cacao beans, cotton cloths, and small copper axes as mediums of exchange. A handful of cacao beans might buy a simple meal, while cotton mantles could serve as units of larger value. Buyers carried their cacao in small pouches, carefully counting out the beans one by one. Children sometimes tried to hollow out beans and fill them with dirt, but such tricks were quickly discovered, for everyone knew the feel of a real bean in the hand. Let us linger here, in this market, and walk slowly among its stalls. Imagine stopping before a row of potters, their wares laid out in neat lines. Some pots are simple, meant for cooking daily meals. Others are painted with designs, flowers, and abstract patterns. The clay is cool to the touch, the surface is smooth, and the sellers smile, eager to persuade a buyer. A few steps further and one finds obsidian blades, their edges sharper than steel, gleaming darkly in the sunlight. Knives, arrowheads, and mirrors are all for sale, the volcanic glass prized across the land. There are barbers offering to cut hair, healers selling herbs, and scribes ready to paint documents or record agreements. A man with brightly colored feathers spread before him arranges them carefully, for feathers were treasures, symbols of beauty and prestige. Green quetzal plumes, brought from faraway forests, shimmer like emeralds. Red and yellow feathers, gathered from tropical birds, blaze with fire. Buyers stopped to examine them, for such feathers were not merely decorations, but pathways to status, to honor, to recognition. Food, too, drew crowds. Women sold steaming tamales wrapped in maize husks, flavored with beans, chilies, or even bits of turkey. Another stall offered tortillas, hot from the griddle, their smell comforting and familiar. Someone roasted insects on a small fire, their crackling bodies seasoned with salt and lime. Others sold roasted maize, popcorn, or cacao drinks, thick and bitter. A buyer might sit on the ground, eating, while the bustle of the market flowed around them, unending and timeless. At the edges of the market stood sellers of slaves. Men and women, sometimes entire families, were displayed. Slavery in the Aztec world was not quite the same as in other places. A man might sell himself into slavery to pay debts, or parents might offer a child to secure survival. Yet it was still a sight heavy with sorrow, and buyers inspected the people as though they were goods. Still, rules existed, and officials watched to ensure that transactions followed custom. Above all, the market was a place of life. It was a mirror of the empire itself, showing its abundance, its inequalities, its organization, and its spirit. And beyond the daily bustle of Tlatelolco, there were the Pochtecker, the long-distance merchants, who carried the wealth of the world on their journeys. The Pochtecker were not ordinary traders. They were a guild, a brotherhood, bound by secrecy, ritual, and discipline. They traveled far beyond the Valley of Mexico, moving into the jungles of Chiapas, the highlands of Oaxaca, the coasts of the Gulf, and the distant lands where the Maya still thrived. They carried cacao, jade, gold, feathers, and luxury goods, bringing them back to the heart of the empire. But they were also spies, observers, gatherers of knowledge. When they returned, they reported not only on goods, but on the strength of kings, the defenses of cities, and the moods of distant peoples. To become a Pochtecker was not easy. One had to be born into the guild, for membership was tightly controlled. Training was strict, and the rules of the brotherhood were stern. Before departing on a journey, the merchants held ceremonies, offering prayers and sacrifices to their patron god, Tenochtitlán, the Lord of the Nose, who watched over travelers. They fasted, purified themselves, and tied bundles of sticks together, symbols of unity and strength. Then, when all was ready, they set out in groups, carrying their goods on their backs, moving silently along the roads. The roads themselves were not simple paths. The Aztecs maintained a network of causeways, trails, and resting places. Merchants knew where to stop, where to sleep, and where to find food. They avoided dangers by traveling at night, guided by the stars, or by slipping quietly through forests. Sometimes they disguised themselves, pretending to be ordinary travelers, for secrecy was a shield against enemies and rivals. Life on the road was harsh. The sun burned by day, the cold bit by night, and wild animals lurked in the shadows. Yet the Pochtecker endured, for their rewards were great. They returned with treasures, and their guild held privileges. They could grow wealthy, own land, and rise in status. Their reports were valued by kings, and their words carried weight in councils. Still, they lived by discipline. They could not flaunt their wealth openly, for modesty was required. If one grew too proud, punishment followed. Their gatherings were secret, their rituals hidden, their loyalty to each other absolute. They were a world within the world, a reminder that the empire was not only built by warriors and priests, but also by merchants who wove connections across distances. In the evenings, when the market of Tlatelolco quieted and the crowds thinned, one might imagine a Pochtecker returning home, his pack lighter now, his profits secure. He walks slowly along a canal, the water dark beneath the moon, and in his heart, he carries not only goods but stories. Stories of distant lands, of rivers crossed, of mountains climbed, of deals struck in hidden corners. He is tired, yet proud, for he has kept alive the flow of wealth, the pulse of trade, the heartbeat of empire. And so the markets and merchants of the Aztec world remind us of something simple yet profound, that beneath the grandeur of temples, beneath the cruelty of sacrifice, beneath the glory of warriors, there was the daily exchange of goods. The steady hum of trade, the endless rhythm of life itself. It was this rhythm that fed the empire, sustained its people, and gave shape to their days. Chapter 7. Gods and Rituals. In the heart of Tenochtitlán, rising above the canals, the markets, and the houses of common folk, stood the great temple, the Templo Mayor. Its twin staircases climbed upward, one leading to the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, the other to the shrine of Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Together, these twin deities represented the balance of life and death, of battle and nourishment, of the forces that sustained the Aztec world. The temple was the center of the city, but it was also more than stone, more than steps, more than a building. It was the axis of the cosmos, the point where heaven, earth, and the underworld touched. And so, to understand the Aztecs, one must sit quietly before their gods and listen to the slow rhythm of their rituals. The Aztec pantheon was vast. It held hundreds of gods, each with names that echoed like poetry, each with roles that touched upon some part of existence. At its head were great powers, Huitzilopochtli, the left-handed hummingbird, who demanded blood to keep the sun moving across the sky, Tlaloc, whose rains fed the maize but whose storms could also destroy, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. God of wisdom, wind, and creation, who was revered even in distant lands, Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, god of night, fate, and sorcery, a force of challenge and conflict. These were not abstract figures but living presences, their stories woven into the very fabric of the world. The Aztecs believed that the universe had passed through ages, or suns, each destroyed and replaced. The current age, the fifth sun, was fragile, requiring nourishment to endure. That nourishment was blood, for blood carried Tenali, the vital energy, the warmth of the sun itself. Every ritual, every offering, every sacrifice was given to maintain balance, to feed the cosmos, to keep the sun rising and the rains falling. Without it, they believed, darkness would descend, and the world would collapse into chaos. Let us walk slowly through a festival day, moving step by step, as though drifting with the crowd toward the temple precinct. The plaza before the Templo Mayor is filled with people, their garments bright with cotton and feathers. Vendors sell food at the edges, but the center is reserved for ceremony. Priests move in silence, their faces painted with black soot, their hair matted with blood, their garments simple. They carry copal incense in clay burners, and as they pass, the air fills with thick white smoke, rising in clouds, twisting upward as though it carries prayers to the sky. Drums sound, deep and resonant, their beats slow, steady, and unending. Flutes join, their notes high and piercing. The music does not entertain but transforms, lifting the minds of the listeners into another state. The crowd murmurs prayers, the words blending together, a low hum that vibrates like the voice of the earth itself. At the steps of the temple, offerings are laid out: flowers, food, cotton, feathers, and small images of the gods made of dough. Children bring baskets of maize, women bring pots of water, men carry bundles of wood. These gifts are not wasted, they are consumed in ritual, burned, buried, or distributed, each action symbolic, each a thread in the web of meaning. The priests ascend the staircases slowly, step by step, carrying images of the gods on litters. Their bodies move with effort, their breathing heavy, but they do not falter. At the top, before the shrines, they set the images down, sprinkle blood, and scatter flowers. A cry rises from the crowd below, a sound of awe and fear, for they know that in these moments, the gods themselves draw near. Sacrifice was the core of Aztec ritual, and though it chills modern minds, for the Aztecs it was sacred necessity. Captives taken in war were led up the temple steps, their faces painted, their bodies adorned with feathers and garlands. They did not walk alone but were accompanied by priests, musicians, and dancers, for even death was given dignity through ceremony. At the summit, the victim was stretched upon a stone, and with a sharp obsidian blade, the priest opened the chest, raising the still beating heart to the sky. The blood flowed down the steps, staining the stone, while the people below cried out in reverence. To them, this was not cruelty but devotion. The heart was food for the sun, and the body was sacred offering. Yet sacrifice was not only of humans. Offerings of animals, of birds, of dogs, of butterflies, of rabbits were common. Precious goods were also sacrificed: jade beads, gold ornaments, fine cloth, and even entire temples of miniature scale made from dough or paper. The idea was always the same: to give up something valuable, to nourish the divine, to maintain the cycle of existence. Festivals followed the calendar, and the Aztec calendar was itself a marvel of order and complexity. Two cycles intertwined: the Zupo-Huarli, a solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days, and the Tonalpohualli, a sacred cycle of 260 days, used for divination and ritual. Together, they created a rhythm that guided when to plant, when to harvest, when to wage war, and when to hold ceremonies. Each month had its festivals, each dedicated to particular gods, each with its own rituals, dances, costumes, and sacrifices. Take, for example, the festival of Tlercaxupehualistli, dedicated to Xipe Totec, the flayed lord, god of renewal and agriculture. In this festival, captives were sacrificed in gladiatorial combat, bound to a stone and given a weapon, forced to fight against trained warriors. After their death, their skins were flayed and worn by priests, who walked through the city as living embodiments of the god. To the Aztecs, this was not horror but hope, for just as the maize plant shed its husk to grow, so too did life renew itself through death. Or consider the festival of Toxcatl, in which a young man was chosen to impersonate Tezcatlipoca for an entire year. He was dressed in finery, treated with honor, and given wives. He played the flute as he walked the streets, and people bowed before him. Yet at the end of the year, He was sacrificed, his role complete, his body given to the gods. The cycle repeated, year after year, the impersonator becoming the god living through the man, the people reminded of the impermanence of life and the eternal presence of fate. Even ordinary people participated in ritual. Families offered blood from their ears or tongues, piercing themselves with maguey thorns, letting drops fall onto paper, which was then burned. Farmers prayed to Tlaloc for rain. Children were sometimes sacrificed to him, their tears believed to bring showers. Warriors swore oaths before idols, merchants prayed to Tenochtitlán before journeys, midwives called upon goddesses during childbirth. Life itself was inseparable from ritual, for the divine was not distant but present in every breath, every meal, every step. The priests lived apart, dedicated wholly to the gods. Their lives were austere, fasting, penance, wakefulness. They slept little, rising at midnight to tend the fires, to chant, to watch the stars. Their bodies bore scars of devotion, for they pierced themselves often, bleeding as offerings. They studied the calendar, interpreted omens, and guided the people in the ways of devotion. Though feared for their role in sacrifice, they were also respected, for they maintained the fragile balance of the cosmos. Temples dotted the land, not only the Templo Mayor but also countless smaller shrines. Each neighborhood had its gods, each family had its altars. Mountains, caves, rivers, and springs were sacred, for the earth itself was divine. Pilgrims traveled to holy places, carrying offerings, singing songs, binding themselves to traditions older than memory. And always, the smoke of incense rose. Copal was the breath of ritual, its sweet fragrance drifting through the air, clinging to hair, clothes, and skin. It carried prayers upward, it cleansed, it sanctified. To walk through Tenochtitlán on a festival day was to be enveloped in that smoke, to feel it sting the eyes, to smell it in the lungs, to sense the nearness of gods. The Aztec world, then, was not merely of stone, water, and maize. It was a world woven with gods, bound by rituals, sustained by sacrifice. Every beat of the drum, every step of the dance, every drop of blood was part of a great cycle. To live as an Aztec was to live in a universe alive with powers, demanding and generous, terrible and beautiful. And so, when we think of the Aztecs, we must think not only of warriors and markets, not only of emperors and conquests, but of the endless rhythm of ritual. For it was ritual that gave meaning, that bound the people together, that fed the sun, that kept the rains falling, that sustained the fifth sun itself. Without it, they believed, all would collapse into darkness. With it, they walked in balance, for a time, in a world alive with gods. Chapter 8. Daily Life of the Aztecs. In the Valley of Mexico, in the years before the arrival of the Spaniards, life in the great city of Tenochtitlan unfolded in patterns as steady as the sunrise and as ancient as the maize that grew in the Chinampers. For all the splendor of temples and the drama of sacrifices, for all the noise of markets and the march of warriors, there was also the ordinary rhythm of daily life. It was a rhythm woven from small tasks, familiar duties, and repeated motions, and it was this rhythm that gave stability to the empire. To understand the Aztecs fully, one must leave aside the kings and priests for a time, and walk quietly into the neighborhoods, into the houses of common folk, and into the daily habits that sustained them. Morning began early, often before the first light of dawn. In the simple houses made of adobe and reeds, families stirred awake. The houses were not large, usually 1 or 2 rooms, with a central hearth where meals were cooked. Mats of woven reeds served as beds, rolled up during the day to make space. Children slept beside parents, wrapped in blankets against the chill of the highland air. As the first glow appeared in the east, the mother of the household would rise to prepare the morning meal. She ground maize on a stone metate, pushing the heavy grinding stone back and forth, until the kernels became soft dough. The sound of grinding was constant in the city, a low background rhythm, heard from one house to the next. From this dough, called marcer, tortillas were made. Flat, round, cooked on a clay griddle, they were the foundation of every meal. Sometimes tamales were prepared instead, steamed in maize husks, filled with beans, chilies, or vegetables. To these staples, a family might add whatever else they had, perhaps beans cooked in clay pots, perhaps squash, perhaps a bit of chili sauce to bring flavor. Meat was rare, reserved for special occasions, but fish, insects, and eggs could supplement the diet. For most, however, it was maize, beans, and chilies that sustained life, day after day, year after year. Children had duties from a young age. Boys might fetch water from the canal in clay jars, careful not to spill. Girls helped their mothers with grinding, weaving, or carrying wood. Laziness was not tolerated. The Aztec world believed that discipline shaped character, and children were raised with strictness. Fathers taught sons to work the fields, to fish, to handle tools. Mothers taught daughters to cook, to weave, to manage a household. Even before formal education, life itself was a school, teaching patience, endurance, and obedience. As the sun rose higher, men and women set out to their tasks. Some went to the chinampers, the floating fields built upon the shallow waters of the lake. These ingenious plots of land, created by layering mud, reeds, and soil, produced abundant crops. Maize grew tall in rows, beans climbed their stalks, and squash spread across the ground. The chinampers were separated by canals, navigated by canoes, and they formed a patchwork of green across the lake's surface. Farmers worked slowly, tending the plants, pulling weeds, and guiding water to where it was needed. Their labor fed not only their families but the entire city, for Tenochtitlán depended upon these gardens for its survival. Others went to the markets, carrying goods to sell or trade. Women might bring woven cloth or embroidered garments. Men might carry firewood, fish, or tools. Artisans brought pottery, jewelry, or obsidian blades. Every family sought to contribute something, for the market was not merely a place of wealth but a place of survival. Without exchange, without trade, the household could not endure. Children, too, had their own form of schooling. At a certain age, boys and girls were sent to formal schools, for education was universal in the Aztec world. Boys of common families attended the Tenochtitlan, their house of youth, where they learned discipline, farming, basic warfare, and respect for the gods. They rose early, carried wood for the school, and practiced drills. Girls attended schools where they learned weaving, household duties, and ritual songs. The sons of nobles, meanwhile, went to the Karmakak, where they studied advanced religion, astronomy, history, and governance. These schools were demanding, but they ensured that every generation carried forward the knowledge and traditions of the people. Marriage was an important milestone, arranged by families rather than left to chance. Matchmakers consulted omens, parents discussed alliances, and once an agreement was reached, ceremonies were held. The bride was carried on the back of her female relatives to the house of the groom, her hands kept still to symbolize modesty. At the ceremony, her mantle was tied to the cloak of her husband, binding them together. The hearth fire was rekindled, symbolizing new life. Marriage was practical, but it was also sacred, for through it households were joined, and the rhythm of daily life continued. The Aztec household was both a physical and spiritual unit. Each family maintained a small altar, where incense was burned, and prayers were offered. Daily offerings might include food, flowers, or drops of blood drawn from the ear. The gods were present not only in temples but in homes, in fields, in every breath of life. Ritual was not occasional but constant, woven into the smallest actions. Discipline extended into adulthood. The Aztec legal system was strict, with punishments for theft, drunkenness, laziness, and disobedience. For a noble, punishment could be harsher than for a commoner, for leaders were expected to set an example. Children who misbehaved might be pricked with maguey thorns or forced to inhale chili smoke as correction. Though harsh, the purpose was to instill order, to shape individuals into reliable members of society. As the day moved toward afternoon, the city bustled with activity. Canoes carried goods through the canals. Artisans sat in workshops, shaping clay, carving stone, or polishing obsidian. Women spun cotton on spindles, their fingers moving endlessly, weaving thread into cloth on backstrap looms. The sound of weaving, the creak of wood, the hum of voices, blended into a constant background. Life was labor, but it was also continuity, the repeating of tasks that had been done for generations. Festivals interrupted the routine, bringing joy and color. Each neighborhood participated in processions, dances, and rituals. Costumes of feathers and paint transformed ordinary people into gods and animals. Music filled the streets, drums echoing through the canals. For a few days, life lifted beyond the ordinary, becoming spectacle, becoming theater. Yet when the festival ended, people returned to grinding maize, tending chinampers, weaving cloth, and the cycle began again. Evening brought families back together. After the day's work, they gathered around the hearth, eating tortillas, beans, and whatever else was available. Stories were told, songs were sung, prayers were said. Children listened to tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors. Laughter mixed with the crackle of firewood. Slowly, one by one, they unrolled their mats, lay down, and drifted into sleep, knowing that with the dawn the cycle would begin again. Life for nobles was different, yet bound by the same rhythms. In their larger houses, with courtyards and gardens, noble families enjoyed greater wealth. Their meals included more meat, more variety, and more luxury. Their children studied more deeply, trained for leadership, and prepared for roles in government, priesthood, or military command. Yet even they relied on maize, beans, and chilies, even they observed rituals, even they followed the cycles of the calendar. Wealth did not free them from the structure of society, it only gave them different roles within it. The daily life of the Aztecs was not lived in isolation but in community. Neighborhoods, or calpulli, formed the foundation of society. Each calpulli had its own temple, its own leaders, its own lands. Families within the calpulli shared responsibilities, maintaining canals, building causeways, defending the area, and supporting festivals. Identity was not individual but collective, for to belong to a calpulli was to have a place in the great web of society. And so, from dawn to dusk, from birth to death, the lives of the Aztecs unfolded in cycles. Grinding maize, weaving cloth, tending chinampers, teaching children, observing rituals, enforcing discipline, these were the patterns that sustained the empire. Though emperors ruled, though warriors fought, though priests sacrificed, it was the daily labor of countless men and women that held the world together. To walk through Tenochtitlán in those days was to see this rhythm everywhere. In the canals, farmers paddled canoes heavy with vegetables. In workshops, artisans shaped obsidian into blades sharper than steel. In houses, women spun cotton into thread. In schools, boys carried wood and memorized prayers. In markets, traders haggled over cacao beans. In temples, priests burned incense. It was all part of one great cycle, the rhythm of daily life, the heartbeat of the empire. And so we remember the Aztecs not only for their temples and their sacrifices, but for their ordinary days, their simple meals, their endless labor, their devotion, their discipline, their families, their neighborhoods. For in these small, repeated actions lay the strength of the empire, and in these rhythms lay the essence of life itself. The Aztec Empire was not only a world of warriors, priests, and merchants. It was also, very quietly and steadily, a world of builders. Long before the Spaniards ever saw the city of Tenochtitlan, it rose from the surface of Lake Texcoco like something out of legend. They described it as glittering in the morning light, its pyramids rising from the waters, its whitewashed palaces reflecting the sun. Yet behind that wonder was no magic. It was the labor of thousands upon thousands of builders, men and women who cut stone, shaped wood, mixed lime, and carried heavy burdens. Their story is one of patience, of persistence, and of quiet skill. To understand the Aztec Empire, you must imagine the foundations upon which it was built, not just metaphorically, but literally. In the early days, the Mexica were wanderers, moving from place to place in the Valley of Mexico, until at last they settled on islands in the marshy lake. There, the ground was soft, wet, and shifting. To build anything permanent was a challenge. The Mexica learned to drive wooden stakes into the mud, to lay mats of reeds, to pile earth and stone upon them until they formed stable platforms. Upon these platforms, they raised houses, shrines, and eventually great temples. Picture the mornings, when work began. The builders rose with the sun, often after a simple meal of maize gruel, and walked toward the worksite with tools over their shoulders. These tools were simple but effective: stone hammers, wooden mallets, obsidian blades, chisels made of harder stone, and carrying frames to balance loads across their backs. The sound of work echoed across the city, the steady thud of hammer on stone, the scrape of wood being cut, the creak of ropes as heavy beams were hoisted into place. The city itself was a marvel of engineering. 3 great causeways connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland, each wide enough for armies and traders to pass along. These were not built in a day, nor even in a year. They required careful planning, layers of stone and earth packed firmly, channels cut for canoes to pass through, and bridges built that could be raised in times of danger. Imagine the builders, ankle-deep in the water, lifting baskets of stone, one after another, hour after hour, as oversize called out instructions. The work was slow, repetitive, but steady. Over weeks, months, and years, the causeways extended outward until the city stood connected to the valley beyond. Within the city, the builders raised temples. The most famous was the Templo Mayor, the great temple, which rose in layers over generations. Each new ruler sought to enlarge and embellish it, to honor the gods with ever grander offerings. Builders stripped away old stone and carried in new. They mixed lime for plaster, hauled timber for scaffolding, and lifted massive blocks using nothing but ropes, levers, and human strength. The temple rose like a mountain in the heart of the city, twin stairways climbing upward, one painted red for Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, the other painted blue for Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. The steps were steep, the climb arduous, but that was part of the design, to humble those who ascended, to remind them of the power of the gods. Around the temple stood palaces, schools, ball courts, and houses. Each had its own builders, working in teams, directed by master architects and overseers. The common houses were simple, made of adobe bricks, reeds, and thatched roofs. Yet even these required skill. Adobe had to be mixed and dried, roofs carefully woven to shed rain, walls plastered and whitewashed to reflect the sun. The richer houses were more elaborate, with courtyards, carved doorways, painted murals, and tiled floors. Builders moved patiently through each stage, from laying foundations to polishing walls. The aqueducts were another marvel. Fresh water was brought into the city from springs at Chapultepec, carried across stone channels supported by arches. Builders had to measure the slope carefully, so the water would flow steadily without spilling. Stone was cut and fitted, mortar applied, surfaces smoothed, until the channels gleamed in the sun. Imagine the builders crouched along the length of the aqueduct, checking each join, each angle, adjusting stone until it fit perfectly. Markets, too, required builders. The great market of Tlatelolco was not simply an open space. It was carefully laid out, with rows for different goods, platforms for judges, and storage areas for goods. Builders leveled the ground, paved walkways, raised canopies of wood and reed for shade. The market could hold tens of thousands of people, yet it functioned smoothly, because builders had made it so. Everywhere in the empire, builders left their mark. In smaller towns, they raised temples and plazas, often in the same style as the capital. In distant provinces, they built fortresses and garrisons, watchtowers along roads, and granaries to hold tribute. Roads themselves were works of art, straight, well-maintained, sometimes lined with trees. Builders worked in crews, cutting through hills, filling low ground, laying stone paving. Along the way, they built resting places for travelers, small shrines, and markers to show the path. The builders were not free from hardship. Their labor was heavy, their tools basic, and the demands of rulers unrelenting. Tribute often took the form of labor, with towns sending groups of workers to the capital to build for weeks or months at a time. These men left their families behind, carried their tools, and labored under the sun. Oversize ensured that work continued without pause, and though the builders were provided food, it was simple and plain: maize, beans, perhaps a little chili. At night, they slept in makeshift shelters, rising again at dawn to continue. Yet there was pride in their work. Builders knew that what they raised would last for generations. The great temples, the causeways, the aqueducts, these were not mere walls and stones. They were symbols of the empire's power, offerings to the gods, and the legacy of their people. When a builder walked through the city, he could point to a wall, a canal, a palace, and say, quietly, "I helped raise that." It was a quiet kind of glory, different from that of warriors, but no less real. In the rhythm of their labor, there was also a kind of peace. Each day followed the same pattern: lifting, carrying, shaping, placing. The sounds were steady: the scrape of stone, the thud of wood, the creak of ropes. The builders worked side by side, speaking little, focused on the task at hand. Time seemed to stretch and blur, measured not by hours but by how much stone had been moved, how much wall had been raised. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, yet still the work continued, patient and unending. The empire itself was a construction, not just of stone, but of order. The builders were part of that order, their labor woven into the structure of society. Priests prayed, warriors fought, merchants traded, but builders built. Without them, the temples would crumble, the aqueducts would dry, the causeways would sink back into the lake. They were the quiet foundation upon which everything else rested. And so, when you think of the Aztec Empire, think not only of battles and rituals, but of hands roughened by stone, backs bent under weight, faces lined with sweat. Think of the endless patience required to lift stone upon stone, to fit each piece until it held firm. Think of the builders, whose work rose from the lake and touched the sky. Their story is one of persistence, of steady rhythm, of time stretched long. It is the story of labor made sacred, of ordinary men shaping extraordinary monuments. It is the story of empire built not in a day, but stone by stone, hand by hand, until Tenochtitlán shone upon the waters like a dream made solid. The story of the Aztec Empire has, until now, been one of growth, of rising strength, of temples lifted stone by stone, of markets buzzing with trade, of warriors and priests and farmers all playing their part in a world that seemed eternal. But even the greatest empires, those that appear unshakable, eventually reach an end. The fall of the Aztec world did not come suddenly, like a single blow in battle. It came slowly, like the dimming of light at sunset, with shadows lengthening across the land, until at last the brilliance of Tenochtitlan flickered and went out. To begin to understand this ending, one must step back to the last decades before the Spaniards came. The Aztec Empire was powerful, yet it was also heavy with burdens. Tribute flowed in from conquered provinces, yet with tribute came resentment. Towns across the valleys and mountains gave up maize, cotton, cacao, feathers, and labor. They gave up sons to fight in Aztec wars, daughters to serve in noble households, lives to fuel the altars of the gods. Many accepted this order because they had no choice. But beneath the surface, discontent simmered, like embers waiting for a spark. The Mexica themselves felt secure in their city. Tenochtitlan was dazzling, its temples shining white in the sun, its causeways strong, its canals busy with canoes. The markets were full, the palaces rich, the priests busy with rituals that tied the rhythms of the cosmos to the life of the people. Yet whispers spread of strange omens. The elders remembered them well. A comet had been seen burning across the sky. Flames had appeared in the night at the temples. The waters of Lake Texcoco had risen suddenly, flooding houses. A woman's voice was said to have been heard, crying in the night, wailing that her children were doomed. These omens were recounted later, when the Spaniards had already come, but in the memory of the people they became warnings of what was to follow. And so it was, in the year that the Aztecs marked as unhurried, that Hernan Cortes and his companions set foot upon the coast of Veracruz. They were few in number compared to the multitudes of the empire. Yet they brought things unseen in these lands before: horses, metal armor, firearms, and above all, diseases that traveled silently and spread swiftly. They came not alone, but with interpreters and allies, for wherever the Spaniards went, they found towns eager to resist Mexican power. At first, news of these strangers spread slowly, as messengers carried word along the causeways and roads. In Tenochtitlan, the Emperor Moctezuma listened with unease. He was a man of deep ritual, cautious, thoughtful, always seeking signs from the gods. The omens troubled him, and the news of the strangers troubled him more. Were these newcomers gods, or men, or something in between? He sent gifts of gold and precious cloth, hoping perhaps to satisfy them, or to learn their intentions. Yet the gifts only stirred greater desire, for the Spaniards hungered for gold more than for any other thing. The builders of the empire, the farmers, the merchants, the priests, all continued their work, for life did not stop because strangers had landed far away. But slowly, step by step, the shadow lengthened. The Spaniards marched inland, forging alliances with the Totonacs, the Tlaxcalans, and others who had long hated Mexican rule. Town by town, they drew support, until their small force grew in strength. When at last they entered Tenochtitlan, the people watched in awe. They had never seen horses before, never seen men covered head to toe in shining metal, never heard the thunder of cannons. The city welcomed them, for the emperor had commanded it. Moctezuma himself greeted Cortes with ceremony, offering hospitality in his palace. For a time, the two worlds coexisted uneasily, the Spaniards marveling at the city, the Mexican watching these restless strangers with suspicion. But peace could not last. Tensions rose. The Spaniards grew bolder, demanding more, seizing more, even holding Moctezuma himself as a hostage. The people grumbled. Then came the massacre at the festival of Tenochtitlan, when Spaniards, fearing rebellion, slaughtered unarmed celebrants at the great temple. The city erupted. war began in earnest. The battles were fierce, the causeways choked with fighting, the canals red with blood. The Spaniards tried to flee the city, burdened with gold, and many died in what they called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Yet even as the Mexico rejoiced, the shadow grew darker. For with the strangers had come disease. Smallpox swept through the city, killing thousands. It spared neither commoner nor noble, neither child nor warrior. The people grew weak, the empire shaken. The Spaniards returned, not alone, but with a vast host of allies. The siege of Tenochtitlan began. Day by day, the invaders cut the causeways, broke the aqueducts, burned the houses. Canoes fought upon the waters, warriors defended the bridges, but the city was slowly strangled. Food grew scarce. Hunger gnawed at the people. The once busy markets stood empty. Families boiled weeds for sustenance, ate whatever they could find. The proud capital, jewel of the lake, was reduced to desperation. Still, the defenders fought. They fought with spears and slings, with courage and fury. They fought for their gods, for their homes, for their emperor, now Cuauhtémoc, who had taken the throne in the empire's darkest hour. But the siege ground on, day after day, week after week. Walls crumbled, canals filled with corpses, temples toppled. At last, the city fell. The causeways were broken, the palaces destroyed, the temples desecrated. Cuauhtémoc was captured, and the Spaniards claimed victory. The empire of the Mexica was no more. Yet its memory endured. When you think of that ending, do not imagine only the clash of battle. Imagine the silence that followed, the streets empty, the canals clogged with wreckage, the smoke rising from ruins. Imagine the builders who once raised walls now seeing them crumble, the farmers who once fed the markets now standing in hunger, the priests whose prayers once rose to the heavens now silenced. The empire did not fall in an instant. It fell slowly, like the setting of the sun, like a great fire burning down to embers. And so the story of the Aztecs closes, not with a sudden blow, but with a long dusk. Their temples may be ruins, their markets gone, their songs and rituals scattered, but their memory remains. It lingers in the stones, in the lakes, in the words passed down through generations. It lingers in the stories we tell,